On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, tech rivalry, the fuel of trade tensions. The U.S. puts Chinese tech giants and investments through the ringer.
We must always be on the cutting edge.
And what drives the fertile imagination of a sci-fi writer? In tonight's Women on Top, the first female Chinese Hugo Award winner Hao Jinhuang explains. Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Chinese Vice Minister of Commerce Wang Shouwen will lead a Chinese delegation on a visit to the United States in late August to talk with the U.S. counterparts about bilateral economic and trade issues. The Ministry of Commerce said that on Thursday. The upcoming meeting is a breather at a sensitive time in relations between China and the U.S. The months-long friction has led many to think deeper, such as worries over technology may be fueling trade tensions. Before we get down to our discussion about that, let's take a look at this.
Trade tension or rivalry over technology. On Monday, U.S. President Donald Trump signed into law the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2019. Which incorporated the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, mainly targeting Chinese companies. Though it wasn't an outright clampdown on the sales of Huawei and ZTE products, it bars their purchase or use by the federal government and its contractors for U.S. national security.
We're also making an unprecedented commitment to developing our artificial intelligence capabilities. In order to maintain America's military supremacy, we must always be on the cutting edge.
The recent U.S. tariff policy is largely aimed at China's high-end tech-focused goods such as airplane parts, flat-screen televisions, electric vehicles, and industrial lathes. Investigations over Chinese tech companies, the export restrictions, and the earlier White House report how China's economic aggression threatens the technologies and intellectual property of the United States and the world demonstrate that the U.S. regards China as an emerging competitor in the science sector. China's tech sector has had leaps in technology in recent years, including advances in 5G network, artificial intelligence, autonomous cars, and virtual reality, helping to boost the country's global sci-tech influence. China's search engine giant Baidu, the biggest Chinese online retailer JD.com, and the famous Alibaba Group all have been listed in the U.S., and even in the midst of a trade dispute, a young mobile platform called Pinduoduo also jumped upon its U.S. listing last month. But there is still a wide technological gap between China and the U.S., and many Chinese entrepreneurs are seeking opportunities globally.
For more on how the trade war apparently going on between China and the United States affects tech entrepreneurs, we are joined in our Beijing studio Andy Mok, founder, president of Red Pagoda Resources, providing consulting services to many of the tech entrepreneurs here in China. Welcome, Andy. Also in Beijing, Professor John Gong from the University of International Business and Economics. In Las Vegas, U.S., we are having James Sun, a chief strategist of Zocus Strategic Marketing. Welcome as well. Let me ask you starting by talking about the trade delegation, Professor Gong. If you are looking at me for now, the trade delegation that Chinese Vice Minister of Commerce Wang Shouwen is leading to the United States, it's likely to be a preparatory level talk. Right. So what can be resolved if that talk takes place?
I think he is laying the groundwork for concluding a sort of a more larger deal, probably going to be reached at the topest level between the two sides, if they can agree upon the terms and conditions. I'm quite hopeful, actually, and I think I'm particularly hopeful because he is talking to David Malpass, the Secretary of International Affairs at the Department of Treasury, which is very important, I think. Steve Mnuchin is one of the cabinet members are more pro-trade and taking a less hardened position against China. So I think that's a good sign.
We are not sure about how individuals within the administration, whether they're pro-trade or not necessarily pro-trade, because after all, they're going to come to a consensus among themselves as well. So Andy, what about that? Is it likely to help us to see some potential of the dispute and conflict be resolved?
I think so, because I think, first of all, talking is better than not talking.
Yes.
So I think that's a big step
Meeting
forward.
is better than not meeting.
Yes, and I think this is something China's always called for, to say, China's always ready for dialogue. So I think that now that this is actually happening is a positive sign. I also think the timing is excellent as well, because with the congressional midterms coming up, there's a lot of domestic political pressure for some sort of breakthrough.
And of course, that also, Mr. Song, if you think about the timing, likely to be the implementation time of the recent tariffs that the U.S. has levied against China, and China reacted already. So obviously the first round of tug of war, if we could use that word, has already come to an end, with the effects of that likely to show during that period of time. Mr. Song.
Yes, absolutely. There is definitely a tug of war going on here. But I can tell you from the ground, all the Chinese companies that I'm working with would love to have a wonderful and peaceful resolution to this, because America is really China's #1 trading partner, and it's the dream for so many Chinese companies to really work in America and to do business in America. And I think this is a situation that will be resolved quickly.
But Mr. Song, as you are not only representing Chinese companies in the United States, but also the other way around, trying to promote the U.S. companies in China, I just wonder, from your own perspective, don't the U.S. companies want things to be resolved as quickly as possible?
Yeah, in fact, so many companies have approached me to enter the Chinese market. It's so confusing to so many people why these trade tensions exist, because China and America are natural trading partners, and in fact, China now has so much new technology that it's developing on its own. And for example, we see in the case of ZTE, because of these trade tensions, because ZTE is was having these troubles, China now has so many opportunities to develop their own chips, and they're really going full speed on this. So really, the only people that are getting hurt are the United States companies that are really going to be under attack very shortly.
This is global supply chain, as we have repeated many times in our program that we are talking about here. So, Professor Gong, since all of you has said that it is going to be positive when they begin to talk, so the question is what to talk about?
I think the primary things, or actually two sets of issues here. One is, of course, the trade deficit. And I think the Chinese government is actually very clear on this point, that we are going to help with the US government to reduce their trade deficit with China. So I think we're going to increase imports a lot. There's no disagreement on this point. I think what the disagreement lies on is really about these structural things, as reflected in the Section 301 report, for things like China's industrial policy, state subsidies, intellectual property right protection, these things. But I think even regarding some of these issues in that report are some of the things that Chinese government wants to rectify anyway. For example, intellectual property rights. We are going to strengthen protection of these rights, no doubt about it. Premier Li, when he was in Europe, he was saying the same thing, right? So I think these other things are already in interest of China's economy as well as China's national interests. So I think there's no disagreement on these issues. I think the more contentious issues are precisely about state subsidies, industrial policies, and what else? I mean, it's like a restriction to certain markets entrance. I think these are the things that they're concerned about.
Well, there are a lot of issues between China and the United States, but one of the things for a negotiation is what exactly the United States wants. That has to be very clear. And as you may know, the long list that the U.S. has required for China to do actually would take quite some time. And meanwhile, it has to of course, coincides with China's own efforts of reform and opening up as well. So what is the plan coming from the United States? What does the U.S. wants to do? Or this is likely just to be a prolonged negotiation where the U.S. wants to get the best deal without knowing what exactly is the best deal?
Well, I think the U.S. or the Trump administration, in fact, is quite clear what they want. And we could put these into three categories. I think the easiest to solve is the trade deficit. So Chinese companies can buy more. That's relatively easy to solve. The structural changes around trade are harder to solve, but I think also solvable. So the Business Roundtable recently came out to say they don't think tariffs are the answer. They want to see market access changes.
And of course, President Trump has a very different way. So here's a blurring of voices inside the United States, but eventually it's the administration that is going to make the decision, as we know.
Of course, but I think the most difficult part to solve will be that the U.S. wants to maintain its technological leadership, and this is in direct conflict to what China wants. And I think that's going to be the most difficult set of issues to resolve.
So, Mr. Song, if you could set it directly, answering my question, that is, can you ask the other parties who are developing to not to develop, and not to develop in the areas that you are good at, but rather could only leave them to the other areas that you do not want to necessarily play a big role? That, to many Chinese, is exactly what Trump administration has been asking China to do when it comes to technology, for example, which is quite weird. Some would even recall the colonial days by the colonists asking those that has been colonized, saying you just cannot do something. After all, these are sovereign states. Mr. Sun, what do you think about that?
Well, let me tell you, I mean, I'm a big fan of Donald Trump. I've watched him on TV. The Apprentice was one of my favorite shows. You know, and
it's okay, whatever you,
really
you choose to believe or not to believe, but I want you to have your opinions about that, not necessarily in the personality, because he is the president of the United States. We're not interested in him as a personality. We're interested in him and the words he said as the president of the United States. It's no joke.
Right. Right, and but this is where, you know, even though I respect him, he is wrong. He's absolutely wrong in this case, because there's no way that this is how you know, civilization is developed. This is the way how technology is going to continue to foster and develop. You simply cannot not compete when you're in the positions that China and US are in. And I think the more productive way is to really think about how can we work together rather than competing with each other. Because as we know, this is something that both sides want to resolve very quickly.
We hope so. Well, as all of you have mentioned, the tech companies from China and the tech sector, internet companies as well, have been developing very fast. China really is catching up as hub of world's biggest internet companies. This year, according to Mary Meeker's annual report, China is home to 9 of the world's 20 biggest internet companies by market cap, while the US has 11. Of course, Chinese market is huge, as we know. Companies such as ByteDance, Didi Chuxing, and Meituan, Dianping are valued comparably to their American peers, and sometimes even better, according to that report at least. 5 years ago, China had 2 and the US had 9. This is just a matter of fact. Andy, I want to address you with that question, which is, what about that? How will the situation change if we see the huge backdrop of geopolitics changes between China and the United States? Will these tech companies, internet ones, whether they are coming from China or from the United States, a big loser as a result?
I think whether they are affected or not depends on their business. So companies like Tencent, like ByteDance, which is a news aggregation app, is focused largely currently on the domestic market. So as such, the growth drivers are really the China growth story. That being said, many of these companies are aggressively going overseas, but they're really growing in places like India, Southeast Asia, Africa. So I think that the U.S. trade-China tensions actually will not affect the market caps and the growth prospects of these companies that much. It will have an effect in the short term. Not that much, but there will be an effect, but it will be limited.
Right. Professor Gong, you see, Pandodo, for example, has been trying to list in the U.S. company, even though the stock market's been going up and down, but absolutely it has got some response in the market. Meanwhile, you also see today Tencent in the stock market, for today at least, is not necessarily functioning that well. But you also see Chinese companies, internet companies, just fighting all their way in order to be listed, both in the Chinese stock market and also in the US market, even today as we speak. So what does it say about the nature of these companies, internet companies as a whole?
Well, the internet industry in China is very competitive. I mean, this is probably the only industry sector that doesn't have a significant SOE presence at all. It's mostly private companies, and it's a vibrant industry. It's been growing very fast in exponential growth. But I also want to make a cautionary note here. I mean, the internet industry itself really, I won't say it represents the state of China's innovation level, technology level, right? I mean, I think at the end of the day, what determines the technological prowess vis-a-vis the U.S. are really in semiconductors, in material science, in sort of a more
the internet company is more about the implementation side of it,
there's more
the
application stuff. Yeah. So I think even though they're developing very fast, but and there are many innovations, we also call them innovations. But in terms of the keep shortening the gap between China and the U.S. in technological area, I think still a long way to go. And we certainly cheer for the success of these internet companies. They need capital, and they are voraciously seeking capital. And the U.S. Public markets are probably more accommodating to these type of developments.
Right. Mr. Song, you also see the U.S. stock market rising up 300 points. That is quite impressive on the news that the U.S. China are beginning to talk again, at least before the end of this month. At the same time, you also see vibrant scenes of Chinese internet companies still going to the U.S. stock market, trying to get as much as possible, some cooperation opportunities. What does this all say about what really market believes? What does this all say about this vibrancy of businesses between these two countries?
Everybody wants this trade war to be over. I work with a lot of small companies. These guys are all, they all feel that this is a really unfair situation right now. And in fact, there's so many ways that, the tariffs are actually not very useful and not really being enforced because, for example, a lot of the e-commerce sellers that I work with, they're sending their packages over to the U.S. And if the U.S. wanted to tax additional, fees on these small consumer-grade items, they would spend more money on the labor costs of taxing these items rather than actually having them taxed. So they're just the packages are just still going through, and even though there are taxes, they're still not being enforced. So what's the point? I mean, everyone's just yelling from the rooftops now, but in fact, it's not very useful.
Well, probably they have to yell from the rooftop of the Capitol Hill. Probably that could be a little bit more useful than in the Silicon Valley. Having said that, though, let me come back to you, Mr. Mark, about that. Chinese internet companies, very pioneering spirit. And Chinese people work very hard, and you not only see e-commerce but also blockchain and some of the new trends of internet companies emerging and flourishing in China. But if the situation are not as fluid as it used to be, what would that mean? How companies should prepare for themselves?
Well, I think what we're seeing, so it's not just the trade war, but I think what's the game changer here today is the new FIRMA Act, which is the Foreign Investment Review, Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, and that's given a lot more power to CFIUS to block even private investment into American tech companies.
And the regulation is quite loose, so that there are a lot of maneuvering that CFIUS could use.
So I think some of it is broadly or ambiguously defined, so it leaves a certain space for interpretation. But I think the challenge from a entrepreneurship and a startup investment perspective is that it can limit the capital available for American companies to grow, but it also slow down, I think, the rate of innovation in China and around the world.
Professor Gong, what does that mean to the Chinese companies? Really, should they be thinking about the winter?
Yeah, I think they should be better prepared for this. I'm concerned about something much, much graver than this. For example, I don't think it's unimaginable that the Trump administration might even cut off technological exchanges at the university level, for example. He's already talking about making things difficult for Chinese students to go to the U.S. to study STEM
But the thing is, what
majors.
does that mean if he's doing that?
Well, that's going to be a huge blow to China. That's going to be a huge blow to mankind. I mean, the technological innovations are results of exchanges of information, not necessarily just coming from U.S. or coming from China.
Yeah.
It's coming from mankind, right? So just cutting off that information exchanges, cutting off those scholarly exchanges is a big blow to the science and the technology community itself. So I don't think that scenario is entirely out of the picture yet. I think this is something he might be thinking about.
Right.
So I'm more concerned about these things. Actually, I just came back from talking to a university in the United States, and they expressly told me that this is a concern, that they're very much anticipating that for future exchanges between Chinese universities and American universities.
But of course, it's also what they are doing in order to prevent that from happening. We don't know yet.
It's very American. It's very American. America's not supposed to be like this.
Well,
it's supposed to be the melting pot to receive all the great talents from around the globe, and he's trying to cut off that supply.
We can see you, Professor Gong, very compassionate about an America that you used to know. Mr. Sun, before we go, we have very limited time. Do you think American companies, tech companies, internet companies should also be prepared? Because when you have a trade war, one party act, the other party must react. That is just how trade war works. Otherwise, you would have one party totally overshadowing the other party, which probably would go even worse than action and reaction. So, Mr. Sun, should American tech companies, internet companies also be concerned? Should they prepare for something they have never seen before?
Everyone wants to enter into the Chinese market. All the American tech companies see the Chinese consumers as really a top priority. So this is something that is really going to hurt American companies.
All right.
Just as much as it's gonna hurt Chinese companies and consumers. So we really hope for.
Mr. Gong, you want to have your final words before we wrap up?
Oh, I just hope that Mr. Wang will go to Washington and come up with some positive results and resolve this issue once for all. I think America and China this relationship is the most important relationship for the 21st century. There's no reason for these countries to be at odds with each other.
All right, John Gong, Andy Mock, Jim Song, really appreciate it. Thank you so much. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, still to come on our program. In tonight's Women on Top, the first female Chinese Hugo Award winner, Hao Jingfang, talks about trending the fine line between reality and science fiction. That interview right after this break.